Welcome back to Smart Enough. This is the fourth in a 5-part series about asking better questions. And the question we're going to look at today is, where did my paycheck come from? Now, most conversations about government focus on spending, healthcare spending, education spending, infrastructure spending. But before money can be spent, it has to come from somewhere. And understanding where prosperity or wealth or money comes from might be one of the most useful questions we can ask. So let's get into it. Now, for 11 years, some of you know, I was a chemistry teacher. And like most teachers, I spent far more of my time thinking about my students, my lesson plans, the labs, the exams, than I did thinking about where my paycheck came from. The money showed up every 2 weeks, school division paid me, simple. But over the years, I also spent a lot of time around people in business and finance and industry. And it was pretty clear that they often thought about the world just through a different perspective, a little bit differently. They talked openly about money all the time, about budgets, about investing, about risk, about creating value. And one thing I learned from those conversations is that people in business, people who are thinking about money and how it rolls around, they often start with a different question than those of us who are not talking about money all the time do. They didn't start talking about the spending. They started with the value, the creation. Where did the money come from? Who created it? What made it possible? And once you start asking that question first, you begin to see the economy quite a bit differently. So follow me, again, as Lynn of the past and my chemistry teacher. Let's follow my paycheck backwards. So the school division paid me. That money, the province funded the school division. The province collected the taxes, royalties, and other revenues. Those revenues came from the workers and businesses paying the taxes. And the workers and businesses are the ones that actually created the products and the services that people, for some reason, were willing to buy. So eventually, every public dollar traces back to somebody else creating value somewhere in the economy, something that generated a profit. Somebody built something, somebody made something, somebody grew something, transported something, or invented something. They produced something that somebody else found valuable, worth spending resources on. So that isn't just true for my teacher paycheck, of course. It's true for nurses, firefighters, police officers. It's true for the infrastructure we have, like roads and universities and public transit, everything. So once I started thinking about my paycheck this way, I started noticing something else. Prosperity changes what becomes possible. Not in theory, but like in real places. One of the most dramatic examples that I've observed in Canada comes from Newfoundland and Labrador. And for decades, as I was growing up, Newfoundland was a have-not province that received equalization payments from the rest of Canada. And then offshore oil development arrived. And the province didn't become perfect overnight, but their prosperity increased dramatically. And today, offshore oil contributes roughly 18% of Newfoundland and Labrador's government revenue. That means nearly $1 out of every 5 that they have to spend on everything Newfoundlanders need comes from the oil industry. Now, think about your own life for a moment. Most of us can identify the thing that creates a large share of our own income. Maybe it's your job. Maybe it's your business. Maybe it's a single customer that is key to your success. Maybe it's a skill you've spent years developing. Now imagine losing it. Could you replace something that brings in 20% of your revenues? I mean, eventually, maybe, but immediately? Probably not. Because sources of prosperity are usually much harder to replace than they are to spend. Governments, of course, face the same reality. If, like Newfoundland, 18% of a province's revenue disappeared tomorrow, something would have to replace it. Not because in that case oil is special, but because prosperity absolutely is. So this brings me back to teachers. Canada employs roughly 415,000 teachers. And paying them for a year costs roughly $40 billion each year. Okay, that's one stat. All of Canada's teachers, $40 billion. Meanwhile, Canada's oil and natural gas industry is expected to generate roughly $30 billion in taxes and royalties for different governments this year. So comparing those numbers just helps us understand scale. One single industry generates public revenue, 30 billion in this case, that approaches the annual compensation of every teacher in the country. That is an enormous amount of prosperity. And that's that's before we fund healthcare. That's before we build roads or run the universities that students go to or fund public transit, before we pay for everything else governments do. Now, what would happen if Canada lost that 30 billion in government revenue tomorrow? Not just because of oil and gas. What if we just lost it from any source? Automotive, technology, banking. Pick one. What happens next? Do we find another source of that amount of prosperity quickly? It's pretty tough. Do we just increase taxes on everybody? Probably not super popular. Do we borrow more and go into debt, like we're just going to have a giant Canadian visa bill? Do we spend less and cut everything else? I mean, these are important questions. But what changes? What gets delayed? What moves to the front of the line? As we talked about in the last episode, resources are limited. And it's not just resources that are limited. Prosperity is limited. It is no different. Most debates that I've seen, they focus on how prosperity should be distributed. How do we distribute wealth? And of course, that's important. But distribution is only half the story, because wealth can only be distributed after it has been created. So maybe the better question isn't just how should we spend the money, our money, government's money, whatever. Maybe the better question is, what creates the prosperity that makes that spending possible? And then along with that, and if that prosperity, that source of revenue was to disappear, what would replace it, or what would have to change? Because every public service, every government program, every public paycheck, like mine when I was a teacher, it ultimately depends on somebody creating value somewhere in the economy. So think about that. And next time we'll explore one final question. What does energy demand keep growing? I'm Lynn Exner, and this is Smart Enough.